So I'd like to welcome you tonight to tonight's installment of the Silverstein Lecture series. The series was made possible by a generous gift from Herman and B. Silverstein to allow the public, or to bring to the public, advances in genetic research and medicine. And tonight's speaker is Dr. Glen Hanson, who's actually not just a doctor, he's a double doctor. He's got a PhD in pharmacology and he's got a doctorate in dentistry. He's a former acting director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and he's currently a senior advisor to the National Institute of Drug Abuse as well. He's a full professor at the Department of Pharmacology and Toxicology at the University of Utah, and he is the director of the Utah Addiction Center. He's a widely acclaimed researcher, and he lectures extensively on drug abuse. He's published over 200 papers in peer-reviewed journals, and he's not only active in the academic side of research, he's very much involved in spreading the word and also advising people on drug abuse. So he's the author of the leading college textbook concerning drug abuse topics, and that book is entitled Drugs in Society, and it's currently in its 11th edition. And he's a member of the Utah Methamphetamine Task Force, and he's on the state of Utah's Controlled Substance Advisory Committee. So he is eminently well qualified to talk to us tonight about the genetics, of how genetics influences drug abuse and the family history involved. And it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Glen Hanson.
It's a great privilege to be here and to be part of this lecture series. And I'd like to make this as informal as we possibly can, so it's not a huge audience in terms of we have to be terribly formal, and there's nothing that says I have to finish all my slides, because there's not going to be any exam afterwards or any sort of a test. And so I would hope that you could leave here with some appreciation for the things that I want to talk about, and that is, what's the underlying neurobiology as it relates to the issues of drug abuse and drug addiction, and in particular, what role does genetics play in that neurobiology, and of what value does that genetic information provide to us as we try to develop better strategies for working with addiction and with substance abuse. And so I titled this Drug Abuse, a Family Matter. Because it really is, and the more and more we understand about why drug abuse happens and addiction occurs, the more we appreciate that genetic component, and we're starting to get some interesting strategies that we're developing for therapeutics that came from some of that information. Well, because we're going to be talking about drug abuse, I think it's important that we start off with defining terms that are oftentimes overlapping, sometimes misconceived and confusing, not only in the lay literature, but also in the professional literature. If you talk to addictionologists, individuals who are trained in treating addiction, or you talk to psychiatrists who write literature, or you look at DSM-4. Y'all know what DSM-4 is. This is a diagnostic statistical manual that psychiatrists use to diagnose disorders, mental disorders. And in it, there's about 150 pages that deals with drug abuse and drug abuse-related diseases. Even they can't agree on the definition of the nomenclature. So I want to make sure we're starting off with talking the same language. And so I'm going to give you some definitions here, and we'll start with this definition of what drug abuse is. And this is the definition that the World Health Organization gives us. And it says that drug abuse means that a drug is being used in a way that is not medically or socially approved. Now, that's very general. It's so general that sometimes it's not terribly useful. But it's out there, and it's something you need to appreciate when you're trying to interpret what statistics about drug abuse is really telling you. What it says is that if I were to take somebody else's prescription for Vicodin, say they had gotten Vicodin from their dentist because they had their third molar extracted, and I was to use their Vicodin to treat a migraine headache, I am basically a drug abuser because I fall into this category or this definition. It wasn't written for me. In fact, I've actually broken the law because the law says you can't use somebody else's prescription drug. But my guess is if I asked you how many of you have used somebody else's medication, or how many of you have used your own medication but for purposes other than it was originally prescribed, I think most of you would probably raise your hand. And if you didn't, you're probably lying, because I think we all do that. So if the law or Congress decides they're going to throw everybody in jail that has ever abused a drug according to this definition, there wouldn't be anybody here because we'd all be in jail. So from a very practical perspective, drug abuse isn't terribly useful because most of us abuse drugs in one fashion or another. Some forms of drug abuse are very obvious. Do you have farm parties here? You don't do this out here? I mean, we do this back in Utah, did it in Washington, D.C., we really do it in San Francisco. What it is where a bunch of teenagers, usually or young adults, have a slow Friday night. I guess the bowling alley's closed or something. They can't figure out what to do with their time. So everybody goes home, gets a bunch of drugs out of the medicine cabinet, takes them with them to the party. They all put it into a bag, and you reach in and grab a bunch of pills, and you pop them and sit around and wait to see what happens. Okay, well, that's truly drug abuse. And it's drug abuse in the worst way because it's going to get these kids into trouble. They're going to take drugs that they really shouldn't be taking, and some of them could have serious consequences. Is it going to be an issue as far as drug addiction is concerned? Well, not necessarily. But although if somebody abuses drugs a lot, they may eventually become addicted to those drugs. But in and of itself, it's not necessarily an issue other than maybe being really stupid and ending up causing some serious acute short-term consequences. We also have drug abuse problems with our medicine cabinet. And throughout this country right now, do you know what the #1 drug abuse problem is? It's not cocaine, it's not methamphetamine, it's not heroin, it's not spice. What is it? Well, yeah, caffeine, although if you're a coffee drinker, you don't consider that a big problem. Yeah, you could say antibiotics are an issue. What I'm after, though, are prescription drugs. So prescription drugs per se are right now the biggest substance abuse problem that we have. And there's a lot of effort on terms of the federal government as well as local governments to try to figure out how to deal with that. And prescription drug abuse, the repository for this problem is your medicine cabinet. That's where these things are coming from. Your physician is your drug dealer, and your pharmacist is your drug dispenser, and you're the drug addict because you're abusing these prescription drugs. So in this term, the problem with the medicine cabinet is an issue, but it's a little bit different issue than going under the viaduct and getting your shot or injection of cocaine. Another term that's also used quite a bit is the term drug dependence, and this is the official pharmacological definition of what drug dependence is. It's kind of defined by how the body, in particular the brain, although it can be the systemic part of the body, how the body responds to this drug. If you're using it over and over again, the body tends to adapt to things such as pharmacology. So if the body and its systems has seen this drug time and time again, it accommodates to it. And tolerance can occur, although not always. People can be physically dependent on a drug and not necessarily be tolerant, but usually they go hand in hand. And what that means is that you, in order to maintain the effect of the drug, you have to increase the dose, and we call it a compensatory escalation. That is, you have to take more tablets or more pills in order to maintain your effect. What happens if someone's physically dependent on a drug and then all of a sudden we stop using the drug? You have withdrawal, because now the body is overcompensated for that drug, and the expression of that overcompensation is that you have withdrawals. And the withdrawals can appear in a variety of different ways. It can be psychological, so that you're depressed. There can be cravings. In other directions, it can be things such as seizures. It can even be life-threatening in extreme situations. So withdrawals can be very problematic, and in some cases they may be lethal. And in the medical realm, you got to pay attention to that. One of the saddest places where we see withdrawals are newborns when mom has been using opioid narcotic drugs. Either she's been doing heroin, or maybe she's been getting her drugs legitimately through prescription. Maybe she has some really severe pains and she's been prescribed OxyContins. And the baby, as it develops, is seeing the same drugs that her body's seeing. Once the baby is born, now the baby doesn't have access to that drug any longer, and guess what happens? Goes through withdrawal, and the withdrawal can be very serious and is a problem for dealing with the neonate as a consequence. And that brings us to the third thing, and this is what I'm going to spend most of my time on, and that is this concept of addiction. And I've got a little bit of my definition in here as well as the broader definition. I consider drug addiction to be a state of pathological decision making, because that's really where the problems come associated with the process of addiction. People do not make good decisions, and they get into trouble. And so that sort of is reflected in this piece here, and that is that because of this, their behavior is very compulsive. Because of their bad decisions, it's destructive. And even though the consequences are extreme, they continue to engage in that behavior over and over again. So it has the drug abuse piece, and we sort of shake our heads when we see these people. We wonder, why are you doing this to yourself? You've lost your children, you've lost your health, maybe you've been sent to jail, and life is just really, really bad, and yet you still go back to that drug over and over again. What are you doing that for? Well, that's the pathologic decision-making part, but it's expressed in more than just your drug abuse behavior. These folks frequently have antisocial behaviors. They don't know how to relate to other people. They engage in violence. They're very reactive. They're very impulsive. Everything is resolved by violence. They have criminal behavior. So when we look at our prisons and our jails, guess who the majority occupants are? They're drug abusers or drug addicts, because they make really bad decisions. So we put them in jail for 5 or 10 years, we turn them loose, and guess what happens? They come back because they continue to make bad decisions and they continue to engage in criminal behavior. And this revolving door thing has been a really big problem for our societies, because it costs us a lot of money to take care of these people in jail. So we would like to prevent and we would like to treat these folks. The numbers tell us about $500 billion is spent every year in dealing with the problems of drug addiction. $500 billion. Now, before we started getting information about the national debt, $500 billion used to seem like a lot of money. It's not that big of a deal anymore, but still, $500 billion every year wasted on dealing with the problems of drug abuse says, boy, we should try to figure out a way to prevent this. Or we should come up with better treatments so that people get caught in this cycle, we can break them free of the cycle. And so one of the mainstays to dealing with drug abuse and addiction through prevention and treatments has always been education. We've always had this concept, we can educate people out of this, right? Bad decisions, we'll teach them how to do good decisions, and we'll teach them why bad decisions get them into trouble, and they won't do it. or they'll stop doing it. And while education is very important and it's very critical and it does have good outcomes, we found out a long time ago that it is more than just ignorance that causes drug abuse and drug addiction. We've got to drill down further than just intellectually explaining to people why this is a bad idea if we're going to address the problem. And so that kind of brings us to the issue of what we're going to talk about tonight, and that is, what's the biological basis for these bad decisions? What's happening biologically that causes this to occur and then perpetuates it after it occurs, even though this person's experiencing all types of really bad outcomes and consequences of their bad decision making? And if we can figure this out, then we think to ourselves, we would be able to find out what those vulnerable systems are, and then we could strengthen those systems in some fashion. And through that strengthening, we could rehabilitate them. Thereby, more effective prevention strategies could be developed, and better treatment approaches could be developed. So that kind of brings us to the issue of genetics, because genetics, we think, is a big piece of this neurobiology or biological basis of addiction. We know that inherited factors account for about 40 to 60% of addiction. And we'll be talking about what some of those things look like. So if 40 to 60% comes from addiction, where does the other 40 to 60% come from? That's going to be environment. So there is an interaction between genetics and addiction. Is it possible for someone to be born because they have all these genetic vulnerabilities? Is it possible to be born as a drug addict? Can someone be born as a drug addict? No, they can't. That's the environmental piece. If you never use the drug, you never get addicted to it. So even though you have vulnerability, you do not have inevitability. And I hear this question all the time when I talk about the genetics side. I mean, we definitely see abuse and addiction clustering in families, right? We look at some families and it seems like everybody's addicted to some drug, whether it's alcohol, nicotine, illegals, prescription drug. Just seems like every relative in that family is addicted. Well, you have to think, well, there's got to be some genetic stuff that's going on here in order to have this very high incidence of addiction. But having said that, none of them would get addicted if they didn't ever use the drug. So keep that in mind. It's not inevitability, but it is vulnerability. So how can we use genetics? And we're not going to get into a lot of specific technological details as to how you do the genetics and that sort of stuff, but I do want to talk about conceptual connections between understanding the genetics and how do you apply that so that you can do better prevention and better treatment. Well, one of the things that genetics would allow us to do, if we knew the genes, all of the genes that give us vulnerabilities to addiction, and somehow we could detect those, somehow we could do a screen or a map, then with that information, it would identify what the vulnerabilities are. Why is this individual vulnerable? And then one suspects that maybe we could find ways to address those vulnerabilities. We could compensate for them in some fashion, whether it's compensating in terms of how we structure the environment, because we said that addiction comes half from genetics and half from environment, but it needs both of them to be expressed. So if we could control the environment, knowing what the addiction is, then we could prevent it. So we could design strategies to address what the vulnerabilities are that are caused by the genetics. Okay, so let's take a few minutes here and kind of go through some basic genetics 101 information so that you can kind of understand what it is that we're looking at, what it is that we're referring to when we say there's a genetic piece to addiction. So this is a DNA strand. Genes are made up of DNA strands. There's a couple of these strands which are basically sugar molecules. And these sugar molecules are tied together by what we call base pairs. The fancy name for these things are nucleotides and nucleosides, and I'm not going to really talk about that other than to say that's what we're referring to. And within the DNA are these segments that we call genes. Now, the DNA or the genes themselves really aren't terribly important, other than they are used in order to create things that are important to us. And they go through a process. Again, I'm going to touch on this just very superficially. The DNA is kind of read. It's sort of like a book, or it's a template. We call it a template. And it's read through a process we refer to as transcribed. And what that means is that there's enzymes and chemical reactions that allow these double DNA strands to be read and turned into a complementary strand, meaning that it matches specifically to another kind of gene we refer to as messenger RNA. This gene then in turn is also read and turned into another piece of biological material that we call proteins. And you've all heard of proteins. Even if you don't know anything about DNA or messenger RNA, we've all heard of proteins. And this process is referred to as translation. So you translate the messenger RNA into proteins. And what are proteins made up of? Amino acids. So a sequence of amino acids forms a protein. The messenger RNA helps to configure that sequence of amino acids in order to get a specific protein. And in the human body, anywhere from 30 to 50,000 different proteins exist. So there's a lot of them. They do a lot of different things. And they all are programmed and controlled by your DNA. This is an example of one of those proteins. This is what we refer to as a receptor. Do y'all know what receptors are, or do I need to give just a little bit of explanation on that? You know what receptors are? I mean, receptor, the name is pretty much tells you what it does. It receives, a receptor receives, and what it receives for our purposes, it receives a message. And in the case of addiction and abuse, we're going to talk a little bit about chemical messengers in the brain called neurotransmitters. So these are molecules that are released by brain cells, and the molecules interact with their specific receptors or protein. And when that is activated by the neurotransmitter, it exerts some kind of a biological function. And really, at the end of the day, that's what we're interested in is, so what is the biology or the function? What does that look like? What kind of an impact does that have? So you can see the DNA with the genes result in a certain kind of function because of the proteins that are synthesized as part of that genetic process. So what does that have to do with addiction? Well, it has to do with addiction because we all have a lot of our genes that are similar, but we have some genes that are subtly different. And we call these that are different, or they're variants, we call them polymorphisms or gene polymorphisms. So poly means multiple. Morphisms talks about expression. And so polymorphisms are multiple expressions of genes. So going back when we said that genes consist of these base pairs, it turns out that a given gene may have multiple sets or different sets of these base or pair sequences. So what does that mean? Well, because DNA is turned into messenger RNA, it means if you've got a variant or a polymorphism, your messenger RNA looks a little different. And because messenger RNA produces proteins, it means your protein will look a little different. And at the end of the day, these proteins are important for function. It means your function may look a little different. So let's go back to the example I showed you, a protein that was a receptor for a transmitter. And the transmitter is the message that you're getting from brain cells. So if your transmitter receptor is a variant or a polymorphism, that means when you release the transmitter that activates that protein, the effect may be different from your neighbor because your receptor is a little different. Why is it different? Because your genes were a little different. You had a polymorphism, a variant of that gene. So keep that concept in mind because we're going to come back to it several times. Polymorphisms, variant gene expressions, variant protein, and that changes function. So when we look at these polymorphisms, we can associate these with all sorts of stuff. We can associate polymorphisms with diseases. So some polymorphisms cause disease because the variant protein doesn't do its job properly, and so it's pathologic. We also know now that polymorphisms are associated with drug abuse and addiction. And so when this discovery was made, someone said, oh yeah, let's go find the polymorphism for addiction, and we will know what the addiction drug is, or the addiction gene is, and we can come up with some kind of magic drug that corrects that abnormal protein, and we can cure addiction. Now, simplistically, that was very appealing. Unfortunately, polymorphisms never turn out to be simple, almost never turn out to be simple, and certainly in the case of addiction, they are not simple. And a study about 3 years ago looked at all the studies out there in what we call a meta-analysis. So he went and looked at all the reports, all the papers that talked about polymorphisms that are associated with drug addiction. And in his study, he found at this time that about 89 different polymorphisms had been associated with various aspects of addiction. And he kind of mapped it. Each one of these strands represents a DNA strand, and these triangles represents a specific gene on that DNA strand and corresponds with a particular polymorphism, variant gene, that is related to some aspect of addiction. Well, this number is well over 100 now, and there are more out there. So what does that tell us about addiction as far as its genetic basis? Really complicated. We're not going to have an addiction gene like we thought maybe we could find. We're going to have addiction genes that are doing a lot of different things. Should this be terribly surprising that all addictions aren't created equal? It's like thinking, oh, cancer. We'll find a cure for cancer and it'll cure all the cancers. Well, we know now that was very naive. And the same thing turns out to be the case with addiction. Addiction is very complicated and there's a lot of genetic pieces to it. Okay, so let's take a look at that. Knowing we've got 100 different polymorphisms that bring variant proteins that cause vulnerability to addiction, could we use that in some fashion? Well, there's a process here. It's called microarrays, and this is a device to rapidly identify abnormal proteins that individuals have in their system. So if we could map all of the polymorphisms that link to addiction, and we know the proteins, the variant proteins that are formed, we could come up with some strategy like this. It would be a microarray, and it would allow us fairly quickly to map from an individual how many variant proteins they have that are of the addiction family. And we could look at an individual and say, oh yeah, you've got gene X or gene Y or gene Z or gene X, Y, and Z. And because of that, you are vulnerable to addiction for this reason, that reason, and the other reason. So it could be used as a means of assessing vulnerability. So that's one of the cute ways in which this thing could be used, information. Abnormal, identifying the polymorphisms in individuals. How can genetic vulnerability express? So I said that there's over 100 of these variants. What kinds of functional consequences would that have in terms of impacting on addiction or the addiction process? Well, these are some of the functional linkages have been identified. Some polymorphisms are associated with your inclination to start drug use. And that might relate to reward systems. For someone who has a polymorphism that affects proteins associated with drug reward, if it made a drug more rewarding to an individual, they would be more inclined to use it over and over and over again and become addicted to that drug. Another functional association is the reward or the relieving piece. It turns out that about a third of the people that get addicted to drugs start off the drug for self-medication purposes. So you know what that means? It means they're trying to treat some underlying emotional or mental health issue. So they're very stressed. They drink alcohol to relieve the stress. They're really uptight, so they drink alcohol to relieve the tightness. They have depression, and so they take a stimulant in order to offset the depression. So about a third start off that way. Well, if you had a variant that made you depressed or a protein variant that made you anxious, then it's more likely to also make you vulnerable to drug addiction because you're going to be trying to treat those underlying situations. The continuing drug use, there's something different about starting drugs of abuse and continuing their use. The neurobiology shifts from one system to another. So a polymorphism may make you more inclined to shift. Becoming addicted itself, what's going on here? I don't know how many of you remember this cover of Time magazine. It's been about 10 years ago. Anyone remember seeing that? It was a, yeah, I know you guys didn't. But it was about a third of the magazine was devoted to the process of addiction. And in it there's a hook. You can't see that very well, but there's this shiny hook that was supposed to be what makes people addicted. And when you read the article, they got it right. I mean, Time magazine doesn't always get stuff right, especially when it comes to biological things. But this time they got it right. And the hook, as defined in the article, was a substance known as dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter. Remember we talked about neurotransmitters? It seems to be a critical neurotransmitter. And it turns out that a number of our polymorphisms have to do with the management of dopamine and the dopamine system. And it looks like because variants of these factors and proteins associated with dopamine systems, it turns out that they make people more likely to go into becoming addicted. And then there can be links to a particular drug. If you have a variant for a nicotine system, you may be more likely to get addicted to tobacco. If you have a variant for opioid systems, you may be more likely to get addicted to the narcotics. And that list goes on and on. So it may be specifically associated with a particular drug. So what sorts of polymorphisms might there be? What kinds of proteins might be abnormal? One of them that's been really interesting are metabolizing enzymes. And what these are enzymes that tend to break stuff down. And so there is an enzyme that comes out of the liver. These are called cytochrome P450s. There's a whole family of these enzymes, but they're important for metabolizing things like drugs, and in particular metabolizing nicotine, which is the active ingredient in tobacco. And what we found out is that a polymorphism for this metabolizing enzyme for nicotine, if it increases the metabolic rate, these people are more likely to have problems with nicotine addiction. So there's a connection between how you break down these drugs, how quickly you break them down, and whether or not they're going to be addicting. Another way in which a genetic polymorphism has been shown to be a factor is coming back to our friend dopamine, that reward neurotransmitter. There are polymorphisms for the enzyme in the brain that synthesizes dopamine, determines how much dopamine is made. And so variants of that enzyme can make you more vulnerable to addiction, because addiction is so dependent on dopamine and dopamine systems. So when you alter that system by altering its synthesis, then you're more likely to get addicted. Another place where the dopamine system can be affected are receptors. We talked about receptors. Dopamine exerts its effect by activating the receptor protein. We see that there are polymorphisms for the dopamine receptor, which can change the response to dopamine being released as a neurotransmitter. Those also can make addiction more likely. And then there are polymorphisms that affect cognition, and I'm going to go into that in a little bit more detail. Cognition, that's all about decision making. So if you have polymorphisms that change your cognitive functions, this also can make you more vulnerable to drug addiction or drug abuse. And then finally, this little piece here, impulsivity. Impulsivity has to do with how you react to stress, how you react to changes, your ability to control yourself and not do something really stupid that gets you into trouble. There are polymorphisms that affect your impulsivity, whether you're a very impulsive person or you're kind of laid back and you think things through carefully. Those polymorphisms also relate to addiction. What would you think? A person that's impulsive or not particularly impulsive is going to be more likely to have addiction problems. Impulsive is one of the big risk factors for addiction. So anything, polymorphism, that enhances your impulsivity makes you more vulnerable to become addicted. Okay, what I want to do now is I want to talk about the cognition components and impulsivity, because these are really critical to my definition of addiction. Remember, I said addiction is pathologic decision making. So what's going on there? And then we'll talk a little bit about how polymorphisms can foul that up or can change the way that that works. And to do this, I'm showing you a side view, side image of the brain. The nose is here, the eyeballs are up in here, and I've identified three things, and it looks like this is shifted for some reason, and I don't know why. But this is the prefrontal cortex, and it's right here. So you just move these circles up a little bit. This is the prefrontal cortex. This green should be right here. That's the orbital frontal cortex. And this yellow thing should be right in here. And this is called the amygdala or nucleus accumbens. So let's put in the names. Prefrontal cortex, what does that do for a living? It's what we call the go, no-go system. It's really the center of decision making. This is where information is downloaded and processed when we try to make decisions about how to respond to what's going on in our environment. And if you think about it, decision making has two pieces to it. One is you decide what you're not going to do, and the second one is you decide what you are going to do. So everything has multiple choices, right? You always have alternatives. So your brain has to do the two parts. It has to say, I'm not doing this or this or this or this, but I am doing that. And that's what the prefrontal cortex does, and that's why we call it the go, I am going to do this, and the no-go, I'm not going to do that system. The orbital frontal cortex is called the salient structure. Salience, y'all know what salience is? Salience has to do with relativity things, has to do with establishing priorities. This is where you keep your priority list of what's important to you. And so the orbital frontal cortex feeds its information, its priority information, into the prefrontal cortex. So when it makes its decisions, it's based on what you think is important in life. I mean, that makes sense, right? You do the more important things. You tend to ignore or set aside the things that are less important. And then this third structure, the amygdala, it's all about impulsivity. This is the impulsivity center of the brain. It's really tuned in to stuff like rewards and perceived emotional needs. It's about the here and the now. It's not terribly interested in tomorrow or next week, and it's certainly not interested in 10 years or 30 years. This is a default decision-making system. When you have to make decisions right now because you got an emergency or you got a crisis, it's typically coming out of the amygdala. But some decisions shouldn't be made on an emergency basis. So there are occasions when the prefrontal cortex tells the amygdala, we're really not interested in impulsivity right now, and I'm going to turn you off, I'm going to suppress you, and we're going to do the more integrative, executive functioning kind of thing, and there is a pathway that allows it to do that. That's the brake pathway, controls impulsivity. So what happens in addiction? In addiction, we see hypofunctioning of prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex has a harder job integrating and suppressing, doing its go, no-go thing. We see orbital frontal cortex having its saliency all fouled up. Its priority list gets scrambled. The only things on its list are drug, 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 drug. Family, job, community, all that stuff is way, 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 way down the line if it's even on the list. So priorities are all fouled up because of the frontal cortex. And we see that in addiction, this control between prefrontal cortex and the amygdala is compromised. The prefrontal cortex has a really hard time putting on the brake, has a hard time suppressing that impulsivity amygdala function. So these are three basic things that compromise your ability to do cognition and interfere with your ability to make good decisions that lead to addiction. In other words, their brains are not wired the same in people that get addicted or have serious problems with drug abuse. Their neurobiological wiring is different in these individuals. So let me give you some specific examples. Here we're going and looking at the reward system, and we're looking at a receptor. Remember what receptors are, and we're talking about the dopamine receptor, so that is the reward receptor. And these are brain images, and we're looking at the dopamine receptor, and red colors means that there's a lot of them. As the colors get colder into the blues, that means that there's less of them. We're looking at the area of the brain that's important for reward perception and for some cognitive functioning. We've got controls. We've got controls on this side, and we're making comparison with cocaine addict, with a methamphetamine addict, with an alcoholic, and we're even throwing in obesity here. So these are 4 different kinds of addictions. Look at the coloration. Look at the expression. Those that are using these drugs have a deficiency of the dopamine receptor compared to controls. So what it says in these individuals that their ability to experience rewards is different. because they have an under or hypofunctioning dopamine receptor. So what does that mean? Is this a genetic vulnerability? Now, if I showed these data to you and I asked you, so what's your opinion? What's going on here? You probably could come up with two explanations. One would be, all right, maybe it's genetic, so they have an under-functioning dopamine receptor system, but what could be the other possibility? If it's a cocaine addict, what might be happening? Yeah, it could be the drug that's doing this. So is this a chicken or is it an egg thing? And it turns out it's both. It turns out that those who genetically have a variant, an under-functioning, hypofunctioning dopamine receptor in this reward pathway, are much more likely to get into trouble with drugs of abuse and become addicted. But it also turns out when you take cocaine or these other drugs continually, that also suppresses that dopamine receptor. And it makes it more likely that you're going to continue to use that drug. So you got environment and you got genetics working together, and the outcome is the addiction. The two together. Let me show you another really interesting study that was done, and this always has intrigued me. It was looking, using PET scan, again looking at dopamine receptor density, and these are in monkeys. And they categorized these monkeys according to whether they were dominant or subordinate. And what that meant is, in a social setting, there are some monkeys that really have it good, and some monkeys that really don't have it so great. The dominant monkeys, they get everything. Everybody gives their bananas to them. Everybody picks their fleas. They get groomed. Life is great for the dominant monkeys. The subordinate monkeys, just the opposite. You give up all your bananas. You got to go pick everybody else's fleas. Life sucks. You want nothing to do with it. You like to just go in a corner and you hope that everybody else leaves you alone. So these animals were classified or categorized in those two different categories. Then they took these monkeys and they put them into individually housing cages. So they weren't in a social environment, and they measured their dopamine receptor density. Again, playing the same game I explained before. So these light colors here means there's a lot, and as it gets darker, there's less. When these animals were individually housed, you couldn't tell the difference. It looked like their dopamine receptor populations were fairly similar. But when they were put back socially housed, where the dominants and the subordinates really meant something in terms of reward structure, this guy lights up like a Christmas tree. His dopamine receptor population goes up dramatically. This guy doesn't change. He looks the same whether he's individually or he's socially housed. Then this group took the dominant monkey and the subordinate monkey, and it gave them the opportunity to self-administer cocaine. Which of these two groups do you think was more likely to catch on and take the cocaine and self-administer it? Yeah, this guy. He picks up on cocaine immediately. Now, we're kind of projecting ourselves into the position of the monkey, but what would be a logical explanation for why that's the case? He probably would like to look like this. And he can't do it naturally. His genetics isn't letting that happen. So he compensates. And he compensates by using a drug that will activate his dopamine system, because that's what drugs of abuse do. He activates a dopamine system, so at the end of the day, the function, the reward feeling, is kind of like what this guy gets naturally through its natural genetics. Very intriguing. Interaction between environment, socially versus individually housed, and a variant in terms of how the gene for the dopamine receptor is expressed, probably a polymorphism of some sort.
Question.
Yes?
On that previous slide, if you have them housed individually, are there differences between the two populations in terms of whether they are more likely or less likely to use drugs? Does it change when you house them socially?
So when they did the self-administration, they were individually housed. So they're put in chambers, they're hooked up. Usually there's levers that they can push in order to get them the cocaine. So they were individually housed at that time, and one would imagine that their receptor population probably looks something like these two things here. But having said that, this guy was more likely to give himself the drug than this guy. They didn't tell us what it looked like after they took cocaine. So there's probably some other dynamics that are going on there. What was the other part of the question?
Oh, if you have them in the socially housed condition,
right?
Are
they more or less? They didn't do that just because once you put the monkeys in socially housed and they have all these cannulas sticking out, their monkey friends tend to come and play with their cannulas. So it's a little harder to do and really get the feel that this is a social interaction. So how can cognition be influenced by genetics? You can appreciate that a lot of things that can happen in terms of decision making, and genetics would have an impact in it. Genetics, different proteins could alter the way you perceive what's happening in your environment, what's real, what's not real, what's threatening, what's not threatening. Genetics could affect your ability to understand consequences, what's important, what's not important, short term, long term. Genetics can affect how you do planning, long-range planning. And in addiction, that long-range planning is non-existent. Persons who don't do long-range planning very well have high risk for addiction because they don't think about, oh yeah, I get addicted, what's this going to do to me? I smoke now, how am I going to respond when I'm 50 years old and I get lung cancer and I die? They only think about the here and the now. And they tend not to learn from previous experiences very well, so altered genes affect your learning ability. And that applies to your learning lessons that relate to drug abuse, memory impairment, and addiction also affects individuals' interest in risk-taking. Would you expect a person who's more vulnerable to addiction to be a high risk taker or a low risk taker? High risk taker. And if you ask somebody who's a high risk taker, why do you take risks like that? What do they say? Yeah, it makes me feel good. I love that rush. And oftentimes they'll say, you know, I don't find the rest of life really doing that for me. I can't find things in normal activities that everybody else does and they find rewarding. It just doesn't do it for me. I have to go and climb up the side of a cliff, or I have to jump out of a perfectly good airplane with a parachute, or I have to hang glide. I have to do something in order to stimulate that reward system. And they find out drugs does that. And it does it easier and faster than climbing up the side of a cliff. Let me just finish with this, because we're almost out of time, and that is the concept of adolescence and cognition. Adolescents themselves are a stage of drug vulnerability. They, during these teen years particularly, are very vulnerable to using a whole array of drugs of abuse, like tobacco, like alcohol, like marijuana. And this is a known fact. And one of the reasons comes back to our friend, the prefrontal cortex. We said that under-functioning prefrontal cortex makes people vulnerable to bad decision-making and makes them vulnerable to addiction or drug abuse problems. And it looks like one of the reasons is that if you look at development of a 16-year-old compared to an adult, 23 to 30-year-olds, and you find out which areas of the brain haven't functioned, where's the biggest difference in development, it turns out it's right here in the prefrontal cortex. Has to do with myelination, has to do with maturing of brain and pathways and brain function, but there's a big difference. In adolescents, they have a hypofunctioning, underfunctioning prefrontal cortex. I think you all understand that. I mean, some of you are close enough to that age where you're probably still engaging in some of this stuff. But that underfunctioning prefrontal cortex can get them into trouble. Another piece that is interesting is this amygdala area. The amygdala area develops early. So you got the worst of two combinations. You got a prefrontal cortex that's supposed to make you do good decision making that's underfunctioning. You got an amygdala that gets you into trouble. It's very impulsive, and it's really hyperactive. So you have the worst of two things, and that's why you're more vulnerable to addiction and addiction kinds of processes. And then there's the link between the two, and this link or this pathway also tends to develop slowly and comes on board later on in life. So the way the brain develops has a very profound effect on the social and emotional development or ultimate consequence. So if an adolescent takes drugs during the development of these critical issues, critical functions and systems, it turns out that the drugs themselves can change the way genetics expresses. So it's not so much the polymorphism thing now, but it's that the drug has affected gene expression. And that gene expression is so critical to normal development that the normal development gets interfered with. It could retard it, and it can especially have an impact on decision making later on in life. And I deal with methamphetamine addicts. I've seen hundreds of these people. I've talked to them, I've interviewed them. And every time I talk to them, like an adult that's 40 years old, a methamphetamine addict, you know what they seem like? Like a 13-year-old. It seems like their brain, for some reason, got frozen developmentally back when they were an adolescent. They still seem to function like an adolescent. And I refer to this as the Peter Pan phenomena. They're still in Never, Never land, and they never grew up. And when you get them off the drug, there oftentimes is some maturing that goes on, but they still don't ever quite get back to where they should be. So that altering of genetic expression has a very long-term consequence and maybe even a permanent consequence in these people. Well, we run out of time. Let me just sort of wrap this up. So in summary, what does this mean? Why are genetics so important? Why do we need to understand both the polymorphism thing, genetic variants, as well as what the drugs themselves do to genetic development or genetic expression? Number one, it helps us to understand better vulnerabilities and risks. It allows us a means of assessing individuals, and maybe we can get to the point of sophistication where we can actually screen them and say, you know what, you are a type 3 addict that has a variant in gene X, Y, and Z. And as a consequence, this is going to change the way you function cognitively or your impulsivity or the way your reward system works. So assessment. The second piece is, if we understand what's happened, then we should be more effective in figuring out preventive strategies and maybe treatment strategies. Can we develop medications that allow us to address the consequences of those vulnerabilities and those abnormal expressions? And the data are fairly compelling. It looks like we probably can. and we're getting very close to doing some of that medication development that will allow us to take advantage of what we know genetically in order to do a better job in treating these people. Any questions? Yes?
Do these genetic vulnerabilities show up in gambling addicts, sports addicts, sex addicts? Right there. Okay. Do these vulnerabilities show up in gambling, sports, sex addicts?
Good question, and the answer is yes and no. It's yes in that there certainly are some broad things that seem to show up in addiction in general. So like the dopamine, I talked about the dopamine receptors, dopamine expression. That's a common feature of all addictions, is dopamine. So those variants, those polymorphisms that affect dopamine systems are probably contributing to all kinds of addictions. On the other hand, some of the variants are very drug-specific, so they relate to the opioid narcotic system, and that may not be so generalized in terms of other kinds of addictions. So both of those things could be there. Yes?
Yes, this is very fascinating, but I've been reading about the domestication of the fox, the silver fox, and when you relate that these animals, when they get domesticated, they don't develop into a full adult. They couldn't make these decisions that you are describing as it. And my interest into finding out why we find in society many people that they are in that state of inability to decide. We see it in bankers and others. And do you find any correlation between these two things, how the size of the frontal lobe and the amygdala can be referred to this domestication type of thing?
Well, I don't know so much about the domestication piece, although the process is probably fairly similar. There's a part of genetics we call epigenetics, which talks about the expression of genes themselves. So when you look at the gene and then how it gets turned into messenger RNAs and then protein, epigenetics can change the way those genes get read and then ultimately what kinds of proteins get that show up. And epigenetics can get controlled by environment. So even though you may not have a polymorphism per se, if your epigenetics has been altered by the environment, then your protein expression can look very different. And that can be a permanent change. It doesn't have to just to be temporary. It could be for the rest of your life. So in that case, the domestication phenomena or addiction, in both cases, epigenetics may be the underlying issue that's changing what the genetic expression looks like later on, and it seems to be a permanent thing.
When you talked about the fact that there's a memory loss with taking drugs or being addicted, and that the young adolescent taking drugs doesn't grow up, they continue, then what are we going to do about recidivism, which is going to just increase and increase if there isn't any way of handling this, if this becomes a biological matter?
Well, the example I use is like a stroke. So when you have a stroke, you damage brain areas, and yet we can rehabilitate these people. We don't bring the dead brain cells back. What we try to do is train other cells to take over that function. And that's one of the beautiful things about the brain, is that there's a lot of overlapping redundancy where we can train other systems to come in and pick up what's lost. And we can do that in drug addiction. We can rehab and we can retrain brain areas that have been damaged or were compromised to start off with, and turn it into a system that is more functional and allows them to return to normal activity. We usually can't bring them all the way back, and strokes are oftentimes that way. You know, we can get them back so everything seems to work and they can function, but maybe they're never quite as good as they used to be. And that's sort of what we expect or we hope for in these individuals. Some we can bring all the way back if the addiction wasn't that severe and the drug exposure wasn't that great. But others, we may not be able to bring them all the way back, but we can certainly make life much better for them and their families by rehabbing those structures. And we can rehab the prefrontal cortex.
Can you actually can they actually avoid taking the drugs or the alcohol or whatever they're using after your treatment?
Well, that's what you...
Stroke is a little different kind
That's what you would hope, is that you would hope you would get them off the drug, they would stay off the drug, and then you could restore the function to those systems that have been compromised. And they have treatments they call cognitive therapies. That has a lot to do about let's strengthen that prefrontal cortex and get it back in the ball game. They have motivational enhancement therapies. That's a lot about going to the orbital frontal cortex. Let's establish priorities again. Let's motivate you and give you the strength to feed the right kind of information. They talk about impulsivity control therapies. That's about establishing the connection between prefrontal cortex and amygdala so that go, no-go system is doing its job. So we have strategies that target specific areas that have been damaged in addiction in order to get them back so they're functioning normally. Yes?
In children.
We'll go with one more question because we're a little bit over time, but I want to make sure everybody knows that Dr. Hanson will be available in the lobby at the reception, and feel free to engage him extensively in conversation then. But we'll go with one more question and then we'll have to wrap up.
Yeah, well, the picture being a hypofunctioning prefrontal and a hyperfunctioning amygdala that arose because of earlier miswiring of children who were in high-stressed situations, and their behavior was amygdala-oriented, high risk, very short tempers, quick to react. And then you talked about, well, if you take a look at these kids who then eventually, on their timeline, begun to take drugs or alcohol, whatever, in order to increase their dopaminergic. You spoke of how rewiring, or where these wires are permanently damaged because they were never able to develop their prefrontal cortex. I mean, somehow it was just totally screwed up. What can you do with these kids whose amygdala has been hyperfunctioning?
What you can do, ADHD kids look like this.
Okay.
So when you do functional MRIs, and functional MRIs, this is an imaging technique that looks at blood perfusion, where does blood go, and you put these people in a variety of different functional or testing circumstances, and then you watch which brain systems turn on. ADHD kids have an underfunctioning prefrontal cortex. And if you have any ADHD kids, or you are an ADHD kid, you know that they have impulsivity control problems. They tend not to focus very well. They somewhat are oftentimes antisocial. Other kids and people don't like to be around them because they're very disruptive. And they have about a 5-fold greater likelihood of having problems with drug abuse. Okay? We find now that we can strengthen prefrontal cortex in these individuals through a variety of different rehab exercise sorts of programs. It's kind of like, I want to build up my biceps so I can load the water softener bag for my wife down to the water softener. All right? How can I do that if I'm not strong enough to lift a 50-pound bag? Well, I can go and get a weight, and I can start to exercise with that weight until that bicep gets stronger, and then I can go and get that bag and use it. I can use the muscle to achieve what it is that I'm after. We can do the same thing with the frontal cortex. We can exercise the frontal cortex with exercises that may not have anything to do with the ultimate objective, that is the drug abuse issue or the ADHD issue, but just exercise it so those neurons, those brain cells are functioning. They're being excited. They're getting bigger. They're exerting more of an influence in their neighborhood. And now that hypofunctioning frontal cortex starts to become more normal in terms of its functioning. And when you expose it to decision making that's really important, it works better. And we do this with ADHD kids through behavioral modifications. There's biofeedback strategies that work quite nicely. And we're thinking we can do the same kind of thing in addiction. We can selectively target exercises to systems that are not functioning at the level they need to be and get them so they're stronger, they're more muscular, and they're more functional, and as a result, prevent or treat addiction situations and get them out of this pathologic decision-making mode that gets them into so much trouble.
But you can't change the polymorphic.
You can't, but you can compensate for it.
Okay.
So you've got a variant, and the variant says, the variant is that I'm going to have, as a consequence, I'm going to have fewer dopamine receptors somewhere. Well, what can I do? Well, I can compensate for that fact by maybe stimulating the dopamine pathway so it tends to release more dopamine when it's stimulated, and that compensates for the fact that you have fewer receptors. So I have fewer receptors to get the message, but I'm sending more message at it. And so that compensates, and it sort of deals with the polymorphism that's the variant that's kind of getting you into trouble. So you can work around the polymorphism and the variant if you understand what it is, and then you can figure out what system do I target, and how do I target it, and how do I compensate for that variant expression.
Okay. That very nicely brings back the issue of genetics and addiction and medicine. And before we thank Dr. Hanson for his terrific lecture, there's a few other people we have to thank. First, this presentation has been organized and brought to you by the Center for Genetic Medicine at Northwestern University, and a number of people in that organization have been key in making this happen. In particular, Megan Boyle and Nell Wasserstrom have done the behind-the-scenes work mostly to get this organized. So I'd like to thank them. Dr. Peter Kopp is the director of the Center for Genetic Medicine, and he's been critical in keeping this seminar series in the Center for Genetic Medicine active in many different areas. And I'd like to thank you as well for your participation and your excellent questions. But let's finish and thank Dr. Hanson, and then we'll have a chance to talk with him in the lobby during the reception.